In high school, students get the message pretty early about which kind of person they are before high school. You know, this is an A student, this is an excellent student, this is in this track or that track. And students learn I'm a problem student, I'm a defiant student, and the grade just kind of cements that. So for my students who have come to this highly selective university, they have gotten the message all their lives pretty much that they are excellent students, and they don't want to take risks or chances on anything bad happening to those grades because that's the kind of person they are, and that's given them the opportunities that they see themselves having.
Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. In the pantheon of schooling, among the constellations of education, you'll surely find grades. You know, A through F, 0 to 100, pluses, minuses, grades. The things that have ended up on every report card and been calculated into every GPA since the days when Pythagoras got rejected by Caltech and ended up at Cal State Long Beach. The very grades that students have stressed over at every conceivable application deadline ever. Indeed, when it comes to education, grades feel like they were written in the stars. Well, they weren't. Did you know that traditional grades like A through F weren't even widely used until the 1940s? That as late as the early 1970s, only 2/3 of K-12 schools were using letter grades? And did you know that research has repeatedly shown that grades have a detrimental impact on learning? Yes, learning. Not placement or ranking, but actual learning. And that's what today's show is all about. Yes, my guest and I talk grading, and more importantly, something she calls ungrading. But it's so much more than that. You see, when we talk about grading, and I encourage you to do just that back at your school after listening, what we're really getting at is what we believe students are capable of, and what we think it means to teach, and what ultimately is the purpose of all that stuff we do at school. My guest today is Susan Blum. In 2020, Susan edited and contributed to a compilation of essays called Ungrading: Why Rating Students Undermines Learning and What to Do Instead. If you're dissatisfied with grades and how they affect students, or even just curious about alternatives to a system that most of us just take for granted, I highly recommend you pick up this book. The contributors provide rich context for why grading is problematic and what concrete steps teachers can take now to move away from it. I'll link the book in the show notes along with some other great resources. Okay, here's Susan Blum.
I'm Susan Blum. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. I've been teaching for 35 years-ish.
And you had done a lot of thinking in your career about grades and ungrading, something I want to unpack. You edited and contributed recently to a book called Ungrading: Why Rating Students Undermines Learning and What to Do Instead. And I want to get to all that, but I wanted to start with sort of a broad, more philosophical question. To what extent do you think it is possible to measure learning?
That is one of the questions. It's very hard to measure learning. And what do you mean by learning? What dimension of learning, and how do you know? One of the definitions of learning is a change in behavior or knowledge that's relatively permanent. But how do you observe that? And then what do you take as proof of learning? So obviously, if one of the dimensions of the definition is that it has to be relatively permanent, you would want to test the learning years down the road to see if it stuck. We certainly don't do that in schools, but that would be one way to see if somebody taught you how to play something on the piano, but you forgot in a year, maybe you didn't really learn it very well. So how do you measure learning? One of the ways we tend to do it is by the easiest method, which is to come up with questions that are kind of superficial, but that lend themselves to right or wrong answers, because we can actually count those kinds of things. And then because we're kind of driven by this metric, then we think that that's how you measure learning. But we know that learning is much different from that. There are dimensions of learning that are attitudes, that are dispositions, in addition to the kind of knowledge that's easily assessed, or the kind of skill that's a little bit harder to assess. And everybody who is involved in education, who is really thoughtful about it, recognizes the challenge that it's very, very hard, and I would say probably impossible to measure learning because it has so many facets. People who are often charged with making sure that somebody knows something, like doctors and engineers, really grapple with this. How do they really make sure that doctors who are going to be responsible for saving lives know the stuff they're supposed to know? And I've talked to people who are involved in medical education, and they keep changing what they're doing because they recognize knowing reactions in organic chemistry may or may not contribute to being a good doctor. So a lot of medical schools have gone to pass fail for their first 2 years of basic science courses, and then they get into the practice part. But they have recognized that certainly what students are learning and how you know if they're learning it is really, really challenging. And what they have often assumed is necessary for practice may or may not have a direct relationship to somebody being an outstanding and responsible and compassionate doctor. So that's just one example of people who are really grappling with how to measure learning. And then also, I think one of the questions that comes up here is, what is it that people are learning? So that's content, but what should count?
I think that leads to one of the more salient points that comes up repeatedly in the essays in your book, that assessment and grading are not the same thing. How would you define assessment? And then maybe we can start moving into what grading is and what the problematic issues are there.
I think assessment at its most simple is just trying to see what's happening. And you might do that for different reasons. You might want to do it to see what you need to do next, which in the case of academia means formative assessment, trying to see how much have the students learned, and if they haven't learned everything, which is really never possible, then you have to do something else. And that may be with a teacher for the whole course, or it may be a teacher with regard to one particular student. And that's something that I think we need to also grapple with. But then there's assessment for judgment, which is the familiar role of final grading, summative grading. So you do this assessment at the end to see how people measure up to something or other. And grading sometimes does one or another or additional functions.
So how would you define grading? I think just to make this conversation more smooth, we think of grades as maybe being, A through F or on a 100-point scale. When you say grading, what does that encapture?
Putting a simple, quantifiable measure onto some dimension of behavior which is seen as a stand-in for learning. And whether it's a letter grade, which is familiar in higher education in the US, or a number, whether it's a scale like our GPAs, which are from 1 to 4, but sometimes 5, and sometimes 5 out of 4, which is kind of illogical, or whether it's out of 100, or which they use in the UK and other places. All of them have the same function. They're all metrics for auditing some kind of practice. In that sense, they're the same as a restaurant review or rating an Uber driver, and they give a kind of final total judgment about what somebody is or does.
I like the Uber comparison because deep down, those types of reviews are a type of competition. You want to have the best review because that's going to get you more riders and more customers. You wrote in the introduction to the book that grading dehumanizes and flattens nuances in student understanding and practices. What did you mean by the dehumanization and sort of removing the nuances of understanding?
So if you had a piano student, let's say, you would want your student to be good at a whole bunch of different things. You would want the student to have accuracy in hitting the notes, and you would also want them to have musicality, and you would want them to have tempo, and you would want them to have consistency, and you would want them probably, unless you were in an international competition, you would probably want them to enjoy themselves, and you would want them to love music. And if you give a single measure of their playing, it doesn't communicate which things they're good at and which things they might need to improve on. And that's true of grades in school as well. If you give somebody a B plus, what does that mean? And I've given a lot of talks now about ungrading, and I often ask the audience, do you grade on attendance or participation? And there is such a huge range of practices that you don't know if somebody got a B plus because it's pretty good, or if they got a B plus because it was great, but it was late, or if it was improved from a previous version and they get points for improvement, or you don't know if there's extra credit for bringing in a box of tissue. You don't know what the grade means. So everybody becomes equivalent, even though we as humans are so varied. And so it really does take away all of the interesting and important information for outsiders, and it also takes away any kind of useful information for the student themselves. All they know is my teacher thinks my work, and then possibly I am an A minus student, or I am a C person. So it often gets really conflated with a sense of self-worth.
And a lot of those components you just brought up, attendance, participation, varied weight on different assignments, it fits into this notion you write about, this scientific management of the classroom, that learning in the classroom can be broken down and recorded. And if anything, we've seen probably more of that in the last 20 years with the testing regimes. And I'm thinking even of things like Teach Like a Champion, right? The book that really attempts to control even the movement of student bodies in the classroom. But I wonder, to what extent is grading and these types of practices baked into just the way schooling is set up? The industrial model that was created 100 years ago, is grading just a natural part of that? I know Gary Chu makes this interesting point in his essay that if we can remove grades, it unlocks structural changes. But I find myself wondering if the structural changes have to come before or with the grading practices. I don't know. There's just a lot there to unpack, but I'm curious your thoughts about the way schooling is set up and where grading fits into that.
So sometimes I say that ungrading is a necessary but not sufficient change. So I think we can't have meaningful system-wide change with conventional grading left in place, but that alone can't really change things. And because grades are so intertwined with a lot of the other structures of our educational system, it's very challenging. So people are always asking me, what about applications to graduate school, or in your case, in K through 12 education, what about college application? What about internships? What about financial aid? What about athletic eligibility. All of these things have presumed grading because it's so convenient. And it's definitely convenient. You have two students and one has the number 2.37 and one has the number 2.42 and one is higher than the other. So it's simple to just say, we'll pick the better one. Or it's simple to have a cutoff that says nobody under 2.5 will be able to do XYZ. Yes, it's very convenient, but is that what our students should be going to school for the convenience of some other level of education or something? So you're probably familiar with the Mastery Transcript Consortium. They're trying very hard to get a more robust way of communicating what the students have been able to demonstrate in terms of not just skills and knowledge, but also dispositions and attitudes. And they're trying to work with admissions departments in colleges, high prestige, but also non-high prestige admissions departments to see if they're willing to do the extra work to read these more robust transcripts, because it's not quite as simple as just plugging them into a computer algorithm, which will tell you, yes, math averaged here and English averaged there. So grades are baked into the system, but that doesn't mean they should be. And some of us believe that we have an obligation to improve things that are harmful. And even though it's probably never going to work completely, we still can't give up.
On that point about the mastery transcript, I've never been at a school that uses it, but I've looked at their sample transcripts and they really are incredible, very multidimensional, and capture a lot of what you're talking about. So let's actually move now to ungrading, which is the title of your book, which is what you speak about, write about. What is ungrading? I think you've made this point, Jesse Stommel's made this point. This is not simply just removing grades. It's a much deeper practice than that. What do you mean by ungrading?
Well, it might be removing grades. That would be the best possible outcome. But I think what I mean is taking away the centrality of grades from the activities done in school. And if you can remove them fully, great. Most of us can't do that. So for me, it's not only calling into question, but completely changing the focus of all the conversations. So I never talk about grades in my classes because I don't have any grades. I am a holistic ungrader until the end of the semester when I'm obligated to give a grade. Other people, I now talk about the ungrading umbrella because there are a lot of different practices that people use that may or may not be the same as ungrading. So some people call it going gradeless. Some people call it throwing out grades. Alfie Kohn, of course, memorably talked about it as from degrading to degrading. But he's willing to jump on the ungrading train as long as we are kind of after the same kinds of things, which is really a focus on learning and student experiences rather than a focus on assessment. And assessment could still have a role to play in the sense that we might need to know how our students are doing along the way, which is probably what any good educator needs to do. But there are lots of ways to assess that don't require giving grades.
Yeah, I suppose when I said it's not just simply removing grades, I'm thinking of all the new mindset it requires of the teacher. Aaron Blackwelder wrote in his essay in your book that when he removed grades, he found the actual work of teaching. What does assessment look like? What does learning look like in a classroom where there are no grades, or there's no grades until maybe the end, as you say? How are students, what do conversations look like? How are students aware of how they're doing?
Right. Well, I want to quote Elfie Cohen again. And when students are thinking about how well they're doing, they're probably not focused on what they're doing. So the challenge is to change the focus from how well they're doing to what they're doing and why. And so Erin is exactly right. The whole classroom has to change if you're not using grades as the kind of lever of action. If you're not using grades to motivate students, then what is motivating students? Why are they there? Some of us teach electives where students have chosen that class with you on that subject, but also many of us have lots of other things. We have students who are taking required courses, or it fits the time of day or something like that. So they're not all entirely sold on every dimension of the subject. So how do we make them, or as I prefer to think of it now, invite them to join us in this adventure of learning in this moment with these people? But my teaching was on a journey, like so many other educators, for a long time. And I've been really questioning a lot of the old practices, but ungrading then freed me to really think more adventurously about how I want to interact with the students. At first, they didn't trust me when I said, we're not grading. It's like, this must be a trick. What are you going to do to me? I'm sure that this will end badly, and you're nice and you're smiling, but you're probably going to pull the rug out from under me at the end of the semester. So it involves really paying attention to classroom dynamics, to attitudes towards student learning, to create a community in the classroom so students are comfortable, so they feel safe, all those kinds of things. And it means having a lot of places for students to feel empowered to make decisions that control their own learning, even if it doesn't look like I might have imagined it to look, but that has to be okay. And it is a lot of work. And sometimes I fight myself. As I say, I've been teaching a very long time, and I used to be a very different kind of teacher where I had certain ideas in mind. I was very much a stickler for stuff that it's really hard to remember that teacher that I used to be, but I used to grade off for not following the right style for citation, because I like citations. I was a proofreader in graduate school, so citations matter to me. But you know what? They don't really matter to most of my students. And what am I really after? So it's forced me to really figure out what I'm after. And it might mean sometimes students don't read everything I think they should read, and they don't always make the connections I think they should make. But if I'm going to really make it about their learning, I have to let them be the actual learner. And it's taken a lot of experimentation, and it's not easier, but it's more meaningful and satisfying.
And in your role in higher education, you undoubtedly see the detrimental effects of grading on students.
In high school, students get the message pretty early about which kind of person they are before high school. This is an A student, this is an excellent student, this is in this track or that track. And students learn, I'm a problem student, I'm a defiant student. And the grade just kind of cements that. I'm a B student, I'm an A student. So for my students who have come to this highly selective university, they have gotten the message all their lives pretty much that they are excellent students, and they don't want to take risks or chances on anything bad happening to those grades, because that's the kind of person they are, and that's given them the opportunities that they see themselves having. So taking the grade away, for some it's disorienting because they're not really sure where they stand, but it also allows them to take risks and maybe do something that is hard and they're maybe not even that good at it. So one of the other practices that I and many other ungraders do is I give students a lot of choices in the way they present their learning, and presenting their learning should itself be a learning experience. So I use something called unessays, or students can pick what modality they want to use to communicate. So they can do a podcast or they can do a video, I've had so many students in the last few years write poems, or one class a few years ago, they decided to write letters to like their future self or their younger self, or a teacher they had in elementary school, or they wrote these hypothetical letters that were really meaningful and really touching and moving. And they did connect to the stuff we were learning, but in a format that was meaningful for them. So that means then that the students have chosen a format that maybe they're not experienced in, but they've always wanted to try. And if you're making a video for the first time, it's probably not going to be perfect. And yet if they were being graded on it, they probably would be afraid because they want it to be perfect. So they take the safe route, which means give me the rubric and tell me how to do it, and I will do that. And then the agreement is you tell me what to do, I do it, and you give me the A. But if there's no A and I'm not telling them what to do, then they're free, but they're also responsible. So it is and then most of them rise to the occasion and do really wonderful stuff.
That's that minimax principle you write about, that if there's an outcome, in this case the grade, then you do the minimum to get the maximum outcome, right? What's the
I'm nodding to the podcast.
Yes, yes,
I'm
yes,
nodding.
yes.
Exactly.
Yes,
that's exactly what the minimax
right.
principle would predict.
What's the role of feedback and comments? This is something that a number of your authors wrote about, Laura Gibbs in particular, how crucial, not just giving feedback and comments, but a particular type of feedback and quality of feedback.
Yeah, well, and feedback it's interesting because there are a lot of fields where just doing something is its own feedback. So during the pandemic, I which is not over, and I may have alienated half of your listeners now, but I learned to bake sourdough bread, and the product was its own feedback. It was either rising or not rising. It tasted good or it didn't taste good. I didn't need any outsider to give me any sort of feedback. Many times our students will, let's say, write something, and it's different in STEM, and I'll talk about STEM in a minute. But often if they're writing something, the experience of writing something teaches them something, and they learn what they struggled with and what was maybe effective. It's also helpful to have a reader, let's say, but the reader doesn't only have to be the teacher. So I and many others have students sharing their work with each other, and the students can give each other feedback. The feedback doesn't have to be, you spelled that wrong, and it doesn't have to be, I like it, but it's actually very helpful for the other students to learn how to give useful feedback. So we do that in some classes on drafts. How do you give feedback on a draft in a workshop that will help your classmate do better? And I also have had the students learn to request feedback. So they come to their workshop and they say, which do you think is better, to have this first or this first? And then the reader, the other student, can say, oh, I loved when you put the story at the beginning because it grabbed my attention. And then they can have a dialogue like real writers have about what will improve their writing. And then I often have students responding to each other's finished product with usually praise, but something not just I liked it, but I loved the way you used the fonts on the infographic or something concrete. And then I have the students do reflections on their own work. This was what I was aiming to do. This I think was effective. This was really hard. This was really fun. I think next time I might do this differently, and it would be helpful if I had help on X. And then I respond to that. So there's a lot of feedback, but it isn't just the teacher saying, next time do this, next time do that. And then in terms of the kinds of feedback, the feedback doesn't have to be about every single dimension of it. And I hear teachers all the time lamenting that their students didn't improve, even though the teachers gave them so much feedback. And often the teachers are giving too much feedback and it's overwhelming and it's not useful. But in courses like STEM, in STEM courses, there can be all kinds of other feedback that doesn't only have to be individual. So you can have students working on a problem, and there are lots of really creative and really effective teachers in STEM these days. So you can have students working on a problem in a group, and they can try to predict the right answer or the right solution or something. And then you can have the groups explain it, and then they can kind of hear each other's suggestions, and then you can tell them maybe how a professional scientist would have solved it or some of the nuances or something. And so there's feedback, but it doesn't have to be a grade. It can just be a response, and students can learn from that kind of response. And it can be collective as well as individual.
You're describing an environment that is very student-centric, relinquishing control. The teacher relinquishes control and takes time. I could picture some listeners right now thinking, I love the way this sounds, but I have such a crush of content that I have to get through. How could I build in these practices when, whether it's the standards, the state testing, I've got to get through all this, and that necessitates speed. And as you said at the beginning, what is grading other than efficiency, convenience for the teacher? What advice would you give a teacher who likes what you're saying but feels pressure to get through a certain amount of stuff?
How much do students actually learn all that content when they're rushing through it? And people have often compared the AP courses to the IB courses, with the AP courses very, very thin, going through a lot of material that's going to be tested, as opposed to the IB courses that go deeper. I think, as you said earlier, a lot of our practices are systemic. So if teachers feel this great obligation to cover content, that's a structural problem. But if students don't actually learn the content very well, then we're not accomplishing anything valuable. There are other ways to get at content, which is to kind of motivate it by something interesting. So I haven't used this, but I know a lot of educators who use something called reacting to the past, which is kind of a role-playing game for history. And it's really brilliant. Some people use it for a single unit, and some people do it for their entire course. So the students have to learn a lot of content to be able to figure out what their decision would have been when Genghis Khan was coming with the hordes and they were a German kinglet or something, and what would they have decided. So you have to learn about subsistence, and you have to learn about social structure, and you have to learn about climate, and you have to learn about technology, but it comes to life. So I think there are ways to get at content that are more engaging and actually effective than just lectures, tests, grades, repeat, because we know people don't really learn that way.
I 100% agree. That real world application, putting students in scenarios that allow them to analyze and apply immediately, whether it's, Model United Nations is a great example of that. The amount of content you can learn in MUN, but never feels like you're, in traditional learning environment.
That's a great example. And Model UN, I know it's good for college applications and everything, but students really like it. They really get excited about it. They spend hours and hours and hours on weekends and at night making sure that they're prepared to represent some little country they'd never heard of or something.
There's no grade.
And there's no grade. I mean, there is a competition and they might have some kind of metric or outcome, and it is for college applications, but mostly they love the social dimension. And it's hard. It's really hard in lots of ways. They have to learn to argue. They have to learn to analyze information and present it effectively and efficiently. And they're learning things that they will probably remember for a long time, some of it highly technical. And that isn't for a grade. So why can't we do that in school too?
What's something that a teacher could try right away? A teacher that feels like this is where they want to go, but what's a simple first step?
A simple first step, I think, is really trying to either imagine or ask students what kinds of activities would be so absorbing and related to the topic that the students would do it anyway without a grade. So it might be, so yesterday in one of my classes, I had students leading activities. They lead activities once during the semester, and they had us, we were talking about learning in this particular class. And we had been reading about the anthropology of learning and how people learn in all different ways across all different cultures and times. And the student leaders wanted us to experience different kinds of learning. So they had one group, they had us drawing an elephant. So one group got instructed like our usual classroom way. One group just observed somebody else drawing an elephant and they just had to learn by observation. And then the third group was on their own. And their point was there are different ways of learning. It was not the learning style thing, which they did also touch on and challenge, but it was more that in a lot of life, we learn in all different ways, but we have kind of normalized this instructional thing. So the student leaders were prepared. They had read the material. They were leading us in something that was effective. The students who were there all participated. We had a great time. It was fun. We were absorbed. We understood their point, and there were no grades given for any of it. The student leaders weren't graded. The student drawers weren't graded, and we just did it. So, and we learned the material. So I think every teacher in every subject can do that.
Back to your point that it's not about how well am I doing, but what am I doing? Why am I doing it? So if I could ask you to wear the black hat here for a second, what's the case for grades? Like, is there a case to be made for grades in any scenario?
No. Well, they are convenient. And there are standards. Like, I've worked with engineers, and we don't want the bridges to fall down, right? We really don't. And we want the vaccines to work and not to hurt us. So I'm not saying that anything goes and there's no quality anywhere. But if we are trying to help people develop internal senses of quality, then we have to give them practice in doing that. We want our doctors and engineers and scientists and humanists and politicians to internalize a sense of quality which comes from knowing why something is considered effective or defensible or correct. And so if they're constantly being told that by somebody else, they're not having the chance to develop their own internal sense of quality. So in, let's say, science, there are ways you have to do equations and calculations, and those are true, but you also have to know what they're for, not and when you use this equation and when you use that equation, and you have to know what the outcomes are. So I've heard of an engineering class where they begin the semester showing what happened when a bridge had this kind of harmonic fluctuation and collapsed. So that will motivate students, presumably, to get the equations right. So if the students want to get it right because they also don't want the bridges to fall down, and the doctors really want their patients to stay alive, so the motivation comes from within. And you can get things right because you care about them, or you can get things right because somebody's terrifying you that bad things will happen if you get it wrong. So there can be tests. There can be tests for languages. I particularly love languages. And there can be tests for scientific things, but there doesn't have to be grading every step of the way we have it now. And if you need to have gatekeeping, it can be a kind of pass-fail gatekeeping with portfolios where you demonstrate your work, because almost nothing in life is clear-cut yes or no. There's almost always a nuance. Is this movie good? Well, what do you mean by good? And so when we give a simple grade, it really takes away all of the information that you probably need to make a decision.
I like the example of languages. What more rich human experience is there than learning a language? And yet you do see in classrooms around the country lots of tests, lots of decontextualized learning of language. And there's the perfect opportunity for everything you're describing.
Yeah, and I ask my students all the time what languages you know, and many of them say, I've studied Spanish for 8 years, but I can't speak Spanish, or my grammar is really terrible. And so they've learned that they're bad at languages, and they've taken a lot of tests, and they've made a lot of mistakes. And so they've given up. They don't really have a purpose for learning it that they can see, except that it's a requirement. And it's really, to my mind, a real tragedy and a waste of an opportunity when we could be learning languages really well, the way people do in other countries where they see a motivation. I've been using Duolingo, and they know a lot about learning, and they make it fun. They give a lot of praise. If I get 60%, they tell me I'm doing well. And yeah, that's fine. I'm learning, I'm getting better. Sometimes I make a mistake. Sometimes I type wrong, which is a whole other thing, but I don't get the sense that it's hopeless and I'm going to have to give up because somebody told me I'm only a C language learner.
And like your baking bread example, you felt invited to do this. There wasn't an outcome that you sort of were reaching for because of an extrinsic motivation. Aaron Blackwelder, in his essay, references the work of Daniel Pink, in breaking down and understanding what intrinsically drives us: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I feel like you've touched on all three of those in our conversation. I'm just, as we kind of wrap up here, how do you see intrinsic motivation in your students? Or maybe when do you not see it, and how do you help students in those moments when they maybe don't have that intrinsic motivation?
So intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation are kind of the issue here. And a lot of students are in school for a lot of reasons. In high school, they're there because they have to be there. In college, they're here because it's expected, because they want to get a job, because it should be fun. And classes often are seen as kind of the necessary evil for being in school. Some people like it. Some people love all their classes. Some people love some of their classes. I've heard many students say they hate all their classes, which is really tragic, it seems to me. But extrinsic motives have really been dominant in their conversation for much of their lives. And I've had many, many students say to me, wow, this was the first time I've learned for myself instead of for the grade. And so I like to think that if my classes can give them a little glimpse of what learning would be like for themselves, that should be something that sticks with them. You know, some people talk about social and emotional learning. When there's a social dimension, they may be more willing to do hard work if they have, let's say, a responsibility to other people. Like my students yesterday, they had to lead class. They probably wouldn't have woken up in the morning and said, hey, what do I want to do today? I want to prepare a lesson for my class. But because that was kind of the structure that everybody was doing and they liked the students in the class, they did it and they did it well. So I think the more we can find ways to capitalize on curiosity, on enjoyment, even hard work that's meaningful, the more intrinsic motives can dominate and the less the students feel oppressed by the need to focus on extrinsic motives.
Oppressed is a strong word.
Yes, it is a strong word. I think it's a word we should actually use when we talk about conventional education.
Well, I'm going to let my listeners find out more about that by picking up Ungrading, Why Rating Students Undermines Learning and What to Do Instead, edited and contributed to by Susan Blum. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed this conversation and I appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. These were great questions and I've taken a lot of notes because I need to think about your questions some more. So I appreciate it.
A huge thanks to Susan Blum for taking the time to chat. Grades are such an important part of what we do. They don't have to be. And I hope this conversation has helped you see that not only are there rationales for moving away from grades, but there are ways to. And I really encourage you to check out the show notes. I've got some important links there, most importantly to the book that Susan edited and contributed to. Loads of great essays in there from practitioners about how they moved away from grades and why they did it. And if we're really interested in empowering students, if we're really interested in finding out how much potential they have, where they can go with it, how they can apply it in the real world, well, grades are just getting in the way. If you're listening, you probably already know this. And so go check out that book, check out the other resources, have conversations at school. Alfie Kohn, the great progressive educator, he writes in the book that there's doing it in your own classroom, there's ungrading, there's moving away from grades, but the higher calling is advocating in your school, going to your colleagues, organizing and saying, hey, we can do better than these grades. And so check out the book, check out all their thoughts, and see what you can do in your school, see what you can do for your students. And maybe most importantly, how can you rethink how you're teaching, rethink what you're teaching, so that students are concentrated on the what and the why and not the how well. Thanks for checking out What's the Big Idea. As always, I welcome comments, questions, criticism, everything on Twitter and Instagram at BigIdeaEd. Hope everyone out there is doing well as we hit the home stretch on this school year. Thanks for listening, everyone. Stay safe and take care.